Thanks for having us today. It's a pleasure to be back at the Lincoln Center and back for the New York Film Festival. We were here last year as well. We had a little bit of we were supposed to run yesterday, run the experience yesterday. We're actually going to end up running it towards the end of this month. So we'll be back with like a date for that. But we're excited to be here, and Lincoln Center and in particular the Film Society have been really wonderful partners with us. My name is Lance Weiler. I am a practitioner, working practitioner. I work in film, television, games, new forms and functions of storytelling, and I also am the director of the Columbia Digital Storytelling Lab.
And I'm Nick Fortugno, and I'm a game designer and interaction designer, and I co-run a company called Playmatics in New York City.
Yeah, and so we've been working on Sherlock Holmes and the Internet of Things. I guess it started actually in the fall of 2014. So I guess technically, well, a little bit before that. So it is about 2.5 years that we've been working on the project. And Sherlock Holmes and the Internet of Things. Has anybody ever come to any of the experiences that we've had so far? Yeah, okay, a couple people. Thank you for that. Thank you very much. And so what we do is we're exploring this notion of shifts in authorship and ownership of stories, and then also looking at new emergent technologies, the political and ethical ramifications of them. So we were drawn to Sherlock Holmes and the work of Arthur Conan Doyle because when he was actually writing and serializing his work, he was writing about different types of technology and processes that were interesting at the time but were emergent, like ballistics, fingerprinting, non-contaminated crime scenes, blood, different types of blood testing. And that work was being read by local law enforcement and others, and they were saying, wow, those are really great ideas, we should actually apply them. And so we thought that that was a really interesting jumping off point, the fact that he was exploring and helped to push forward new forms of, or at least an acknowledgement or ways in which people could recognize that these were new emergent technologies. So then we combine that almost like chocolate and peanut butter with the Internet of Things and also artificial intelligence this year with the notion of saying, can we use kind of a detective narrative to help us make sense of new emergent technologies, and then at the same time, what is it like to have over 2,000 collaborators from around the world? I guess to date, there have been about 150 self-organized events around Sherlock Holmes and the Internet of Things held all over the world, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, so I think that, when you think about the threads of the work really started with that seed, right? Like, what is it like for people to collaborate? What is it like to collaborate creatively? How can people collaborate creatively and not sort of trip over basic issues of like ownership and control and relationships of, collaboration, right? And so we kind of started with that seed, and it transformed into sort of an exercise in storytelling as we went along, because we found that that was a vehicle that enabled us to think about that collaboration in an interesting way, and then that kind of fell naturally into both of our proclivities for thinking about these kinds of technologies and the roles that these technologies play in story. So like there's sort of like one vein of this, which we're probably going to be focusing on today, which is this idea of like what it is to collaborate with other people and use that collaboration to form a shared object, because there's a lot of concerns that come up when you create a shared object that way, like, does it reflect who I am? Do I feel like I had a part in it, especially as there's more people? Do I get lost in it? Do I feel like I just got bullied by other people into making this thing? But also, do I not feel so controlling of it that I get freaked out when other people change it or when it transforms, right? Those are like really critical questions for what it means to collaborate creatively. It's just like, how much ownership can I have over something creatively that I feel like I have some stake in it, but not so much that I start bristling at other people's stakes in it? That's like a tightrope that we very much want to watch. On the technology side, a lot of it comes from really a kind of a simple premise that's just often not found in technology, and particularly in some of these very new technologies like Internet of Things. If you've ever actually researched Internet of Things, you probably researched how doors open, or how products are tracked as they're shipped across the country, or how you get websites from movie posters, right? Like that's like the relationship we understand to the Internet of Things. And it's not very often considered in any aesthetic way at all. Like not even like I'm not just talking about storytelling. I'm talking about like as an aesthetic form. It's not even considered something that could be used, which is interesting because it's a very generic kind of technology. All we really mean by Internet of Things, effectively, is there are devices in the world that are, quote, smart, unquote, which basically means they can sense things and they can talk to each other, right? And that's all we're really talking about. We're talking about just putting tiny little computers and sensors and things so they can talk to each other and share things. And the possibilities of that for art, for storytelling in particular, are really amazing, but only if you take this from a perspective of story first, right? And I think that's really the position that we come at this from, and it's really what the argument we've been making this whole time is, that the problem that we have about thinking about these technologies as art is we try to make art out of the technology in a raw form. We just take the technology and we try to make something out of it. And that's not really driven by any kind of vision, because the work that especially IoT is going towards is all commercial. It has no aesthetic value at all. So our argument is, well, why don't we start with what we always start with when we tell stories, which is the story. Like, let's just make the story first, and then use the technology as a way to tell the story we've made. And then what happens to storytelling when we do things like that? And then a similar question gets applied to artificial intelligence. It's not like we're going to build the art out of like the raw technology of AI without any other vision. It's, we have a purpose. We're trying to tell a certain kind of story. What could artificial intelligence do to help us tell that story?
Yeah, and I think another thing to make note of is there's a whole ecosystem around Sherlock Holmes and the Internet of Things. It's kind of a hybrid learning environment. We're experimenting, and we have a massive, normally they're called massive online open courses. We have a massive online offline collaboration. So we opened that up, and this past year was the second time we did it, and we decentralized it, and you can find out about it at sherlockholmes.io if you're interested. And then we do these meetups here at Lincoln Center, similar to how people are doing meetups all over the world around the project. And then it's a copyleft project, so anything that's done within it, people can take and build upon it. So we're asking people to contribute back resources in terms of what they've learned, maybe the code that they've written, things that can be openly shared and other people can build off of them. But then it's also commercial, meaning that you can commercialize whatever you've done within it, which is kind of unique. So I think it hits at this idea of open culture, which is really exciting too. And I think stories, which have classically been, at least for the, over the last 100 years or more, have been very much top down. This is really experimenting with that notion of what is it like to have it bubble up. And we had started initially where we thought, oh, it would be so brilliant to just have people come into an experience, and what if they were Watson and Holmes, and what would that look like? And then we came to realize that we thought we could set the clues, we thought we could place the body, we thought we could be super clever with that, and then they would love playing those roles. But then we came to realize that we were totally wrong, and that the more that it was emergent, meaning that they were actually setting the scene, and they were actually creating the crime scenes and all the objects and all the clues, it started to become that much more engaging and exciting. And so where we are right now with the project is that what we have planned here to do it in Lincoln Center in a few weeks' time is to run an experience that is taking artificial intelligence. We're working with IBM's Watson, which is a series of APIs, and we're working with Bluemix, which is the way that you can interface with Watson. And we've been building with a group here, a team in New York, an experience that people will come in and do. And the AI is meant to augment the creative process, much to the way that we were talking about allowing to create an emergent space. The AI helps to kind of guide people, in a sense, towards making better stories. So it's not as though the AI is, there's not ever a win scenario with what we're doing. There's no one right way. And it's this idea that how can technology help to augment a creative process, and what does that look like when narrative can spill off of a screen and into the real world and back, And so the project itself, and I'm hesitant to step you through what the actual experience is because we want you to come back and actually experience it, so I don't want to spoil it, but it involves teams of people moving through Lincoln Plaza and basically building out a crime scene and populating that crime scene with a variety of objects, and then giving clues to those objects and then solving with a story that they co-create together. And then that's acted out in a certain way. But all along the way, they're interacting with an AI, which is pretty exciting. And so we're kind of working through that and experimenting with that.
Yeah, so since a lot of you haven't done this before, I just want to highlight that one point, because I think it's like the tricky thing to kind of get about this. And again, without spoiling any part of the experience. This is not a mystery story in the sense that you show up and we made a mystery and there's a solution somewhere and then you go and solve the mystery. This is not like an escape room where you come in and there's a bunch of puzzles and you solve the puzzles and then you walk out having won or lost. Instead, we give you a context and what we call prompts, which we're going to talk more about in a little bit, that enable you to kind of put together a story for yourself using a system that we've built with all of these collaborators and all of these meetups we've talked about. And then the process of the experience is you kind of creating the crime scene for the mystery yourself, and then you coming up with the solution to that mystery based on what you as a collective did. Right? And that's a difference. That's where this emergent thing that Lance is talking about comes in. It's not that there is a linear story that you are just trying to uncover. It's not even that there's like mysterious objects that you put together into the story that we know. It's that we have a structure that enables you to put objects together in an interesting way to create an interesting mystery story. And you doesn't necessarily just mean you personally. It means you as part of a group and you as part of an entire experience, because a lot of the nature of the piece is to make sure that people mix and share information and that you don't have complete control over everything you do, so that you're constantly forced to be creative about how you answer questions and like how your story comes about.
Yeah, well, I think maybe it would be fun to demonstrate something. I have these little tiny cards here, and I have some pens. So while we're talking, if you guys wouldn't mind, actually, could you help me, Michael? So I'll give you this here, and then there's a whole bag of pens, so we can circulate those. Because one of the places, one thing that's really kind of fun about the project is we keep saying the word emergent. The whole thing is actually emergent. So the beauty of that is it's almost like a living, breathing organism. And people have taken it and they've created these amazing kind of forks of the project. Within software, if anybody's familiar with GitHub or has worked on open source projects or just software projects in general, you can fork a project, right? I can take the code and then I can spin it off. I can create something else with it. And so that ability to do something that allows us to explore what it means to fork kind of a story-based project is really exciting. So, for instance, some folks in Los Angeles have developed a high school program that works to take kids and they use deductive reasoning as a way to solve complex challenges in LA. It's being used in Sao Paulo and spun off and kind of forked as a way to look at food waste and using a detective narrative to determine where food comes from, where food goes, and how it's wasted. And they're building an interesting application around that. In Europe, they're developing a program for the hearing impaired. And then there are people who are developing VR-based experiences around it, who are doing things with augmented reality. And here in New York, we're really focused on the AI part of what the experience is. So the goal of it is, I guess, towards what Nick was talking about, it is really kind of like a framework that we're exploring that's for open creativity, this idea of where people can come together, and by seeing all these crazy forks of a project, does it help you to think about what you're doing and expand the notion of what you could potentially do with story or impact, if you choose to do impact. Some people are just doing entertainment-based things around it as well.
So again, without revealing too much, the core way that you interact with artificial intelligence through the current manifestation of the Sherlock Holmes experience that we have, and that is what you'll see if you come back and take part in it, is a relationship that's a sort of conversational relationship. Like one of the things that the Watson is a set of APIs that were built by IBM to kind of manifest a certain kind of artificial intelligence, and The thing about Watson that makes Watson interesting is that it's moving beyond sort of a simple kind of logic to analysis of text, right? So what Watson does really, really well, like you may have heard about Watson and you saw the thing at Jeopardy where Watson wins, like Watson beat people at Jeopardy, and you may like see AI popping around in the sort of like natural language processing and these kind of terms. Effectively, what Watson does is it takes what's called unstructured data and it sorts it and finds things in it. And what unstructured data means is that it means data that wasn't prepared for Watson in a particular way. It means just like random things that Watson gets spat. So like I, for example, might be able to take recipes, right? And if you just think about recipes in the world, there's like thousands of ways recipes get written. If you like really just line up the formatting of recipes, what Watson can do is just take all those recipes in, and Watson can learn through the process of like getting lots of recipes, sort of what a recipe is, and then begin to dissect a recipe looking for particular things. Now, it's not perfect. You can't like, it's not a human being in terms of the level of its cognition, but Watson's actually gotten pretty smart about picking up tone, finding certain kind of keywords and making certain kind of meaning associations between them, and most importantly, being able to find things in that data if it wants to find them, even though the data doesn't look the same. So it could find something in a PDF, or a doc, or a text file, or an essay, or a poem, or a play, because it can kind of cut away some of the formatting issues and just find objects. Now, the way that people interact with Watson during the actual piece is through an engine that IBM has developed called conversation. So effectively, you communicate things in somewhat natural language, meaning the way you talk, to Watson, and Watson replies. Now, what Watson replies with is based on what we've set Watson up to reply with. And so the nature of the experience is that we're going to seed Watson with a lot of information that can effectively help people tell stories. So if they talk to Watson for any amount of time, eventually they're going to get something that's like a clue to their story. It's not an answer, because like I said, we don't actually know who committed the crime. We don't even know what your crime is. But what we do know are there certain kinds of details we could give you that would push you in an interesting direction. Like if you have a clue, like if you have an object in the space that's like a knife, we might be able to give you a prompt about the knife that's sort of interesting, some detail about the handle or something about the owner. We might be able to say something about the context you're in or the time you're in. We might be able to reference a Sherlock Holmes story and like get that idea in your head. And so a lot of the way that the AI used is basically by having players in the experience talk to the AI about what they're experiencing, and then having the AI kind of intelligently give them something back that matches the direction that they're going in. And those things we give back we call prompts. And they're kind of a critical part of this experience. Since we're not trying to get you to solve a particular story, we're getting you to try to tell a story, the thing that we can give you that's valuable is something that helps you tell stories. And what helps you tell stories are ideas that you can spark your own ideas off of. And those are the kind of prompts that we want the experience to give.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that notion of using AI as a way to augment creativity is very exciting. And I think to the point of, in addition to the conversation, the various APIs that we're using are speech to text, text to speech, conversation, rank and retrieval, and tone analyzer, which analyzes the tone and the emotion of what somebody is saying. And then in addition to that, we're kind of bringing in a whole corpus of Arthur Conan Doyle's stories. So it's kind of mixed, and the objects that people are actually interacting with are from Arthur Conan Doyle's stories. So to the point of where Nick is saying that these prompts are used in a way to ignite the imaginations of the participants to help them shape these really amazing narratives. The goal is at the same time to open them up and get them collaborating with each other in dynamic ways. So we do have something that we would like to run. Do you want to do the first one in terms of
Sure. Do you want to do number one on the list?
Yeah, here's
sure. All right, so basically, all of these prompts are effectively used to sort of like disrupt a creative process that the users are going through, and then get them, as Lance suggested, talking to each other again and sort of reimagining things. So again, I know we're being kind of abstract, but I think there's enough information here for you to basically understand what's going on in terms of how this should work. effectively what happens is, at various points during the live experience, the AI intrudes into the player's experience, either through player prompting or just randomly at certain moments during the experience, to sort of throw another thing into the hopper, just like another thing to consider. Oh, by the way, while you're putting all this together, here's this thing that we know about the crime. It took place at 4 a.m. Right? And then, like, there's not like anything that helps solve it, but like suddenly if you thought this crime took place during the day, and then you see oh, it's at 4 a.m., you have to rebuild your whole story around it being 4 a.m. Does that make sense? Can I get nods or something? I just want to make sure. Yeah. Okay, cool. So what we're interested in doing, and as Lance suggested, like, we're going to seed all this stuff. And all of it comes out of these kind of emergent structures. So what we thought would be interesting is sort of having you be able to build content that will be used in the experience, right? Like, all of these prompts they come from somewhere. They come from us. They come from the MOOC. The MOOC generates a bunch of them. They come from the stories of Doyle. We just pull quotes out of the stories of Doyle and throw them out. And we also do meetups where we just come up with prompts. You have now joined a meetup where you make prompts. Welcome to Sherlock Holmes and the Internet of Things. So the way we're going to handle that is I'm going to just sort of give you a prompt in the experience, and I want us to see if we can come up with some like interesting story stuff that you think would be like an interesting seed for a story. And the way I would like to do that is I'm going to pull particular moments out of the Sherlock experience that are moments where users would be prompted, and then we'll just kind of bat around ideas in a couple of different formats and see what we come up with as a group. And then we're going to take that, Lance and I are going to take that, and we're going to add it into the system. And then when people play this experience on, later this month, they will use that content. These will be seeds that create their stories. Make sense? Cool. All right, so the frame I want you to think about all this from is, I want you to imagine that you are Scotland Yard. Okay, in the Sherlock Holmes stories. And so what that means is you're a police investigation. You are dedicated to the task of solving crimes. You are, in this story, somewhat overworked and incompetent. Right? There's a lot of crimes that are going to happen during this experience, and they're not very well organized, and they kind of become a mess. And it's not like you're incompetent. You're perfectly competent. You're just kind of overwhelmed. The whole agency's kind of overwhelmed. And you're just getting random facts about random things from time to time, and you're just trying to help these people out, but really you can't tell them what to do because you just don't know. The crime scenes have all kind of been contaminated. You don't really know what evidence goes with what, and until the investigators give you something to work from, you really don't know what to tell them. But if they tell you something, maybe you got a fact. Maybe something came back from the lab. Maybe you've got a report in front of you could look up. Maybe you just heard from a witness about something. And if they prompt you, right, with the right thing, you'll say, oh, yeah, that thing. I know this about that thing. And then you see that back to them and let them solve the case further. That's the relationship that the AI basically has with the players the entire time. And so as you think about prompts today, I want you to kind of imagine it from that perspective, that you are kind of an overworked, overwhelmed, kind of junior detective who happens to get stuck on the phone because everybody else is busy doing other stuff. And you've got 4 cases coming in at once, and these people are asking you questions, and you don't really know the answers to them, but you've got a ton of paper on your desk, and you've got a ton of reports in your inbox, and you can just grab one of them and give them some kind of information. Does that make sense? All right, so the first moment that this happens in the experience, like the very first moment this happens, is when the players basically get to their crime scene and start building their crime scene. The central part of building the crime scene is a body, like a dead body. And so when they first arrive, Scotland Yard calls them and says, hey, there's a crime scene here and there's a body, you're going to have to reset this whole thing up for us. And there's a moment there where they could give them some kind of prompt, like something they know about the crime scene. Just like a random fact that would be interesting about a crime scene. So, what we'd like you to do is just brainstorm what an interesting random fact for a story would be about a crime scene. The goal here is not to make something that tells the story. It's not like to say that like, oh, the murderer was at the crime scene, right? Like, or, you know, we know this fact about the crime scene that will lead to the solution of the crime. We're looking for more like interesting details, like something that would start a Sherlock Holmes story, right? Like there's a dead person on the ground and we find a monocle, and the monocle has a certain inscription on it that comes from a particular glassware shop. You know, and that's the kind of seed that Sherlock Holmes would take and say, well, this inscription could only be bought by someone with this kind of income, and if it's in this neighborhood, likely the person lived within a few blocks of that neighborhood. But notice how the chain is actually a chain of this kind of weight. That kind of weight would only be used by someone who is constantly using the monocle. Like that kind of logic is where we want to go towards. So the fact of just like an inscription becomes a seed that builds out a whole story.
In a sense, it's kind of like if you've ever worked and done improv, it's kind of yes and, right? What you're doing is you're giving a prompt that's going to ignite the imaginations of these participants. So in the case of that inscription, then they would start to riff and go a different direction potentially with their story. So it's really about embracing yes and. And this first time, we gave you guys a card and we gave you a pen. So we're going to do this first one as an individual. Because the one thing that we do throughout the experience with Sherlock Holmes is we move from being an individual into a team and back and forth again. So if you guys could take a moment, based upon what Nick said, and jot down something that you think could be interesting as that first initial prompt, we'll kind of riff from there. Does that make sense? Is everybody clear on those instructions? We can also just try it too and see what happens. Okay, and then we'll add, so you guys have basically 90 seconds to create a prompt, and go.
Ready? Okay, so we're really not kidding that we're going to use these. So I have cards here I'm going to write down. We'll get shouted out so we can keep track of them.
Yeah, well, and also you guys wrote them on cards too. So they actually have cards and they've written them. So.
Oh yeah, no, I want to keep some notes on what.
Oh, okay. He's gonna be Watson here. Okay. So can somebody share one that they have? Yes.
A single muddy boot.
A single muddy boot. Okay. How about in the back there?
The body is found without the head. However, the head is in the center of the chest on a silver platter, and there's a pool of blood around the head, so it kind of looks like dinner is served.
Okay, dinner served with a decapitated head on a silver platter. Okay, that's very pleasant. Anyone else? Any others? Yes.
A watch was also reported lost. It is a gold watch inscribed with DWM.
DWM, a watch, gold watch found with DWM. Okay. Anybody else? Yes.
The last app used on the phone was to check the temperature of the Eve device in the room. It was very high.
Very nice. Okay. The last, an app that's checking the temperature. Eve device?
Yeah, they're all.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay. That'd be good.
Internet of Things.
Yes.
Yeah, we like that. Thank you. That was very meta.
You to introduce those.
Yes. Excellent. Anyone else? Any others? Don't be shy. You are Watson with him.
There's a chipped teacup and a puddle of tea.
There's a chipped teacup and a puddle of tea. In the puddle of tea. Okay.
Cool. Anything else? Okay, so just to repeat them back to you so you heard the ones that you said, to get a sense of kind of like what a range could be. So a single muddy boot print, decapitated body with head instead of chest on a silver platter. There's a watch was reported missing, a gold watch labeled DWM. The last app used on the phone was a temperature app setting an Eve thermostat, and the temperature was very high. And there was a puddle of tea with a chipped teacup in it. Right? And so what I kind of want you to imagine is like, we deliberately sort of avoided talking about what the prompt was going to be for a while and sort of set a stage of like, oh, there's a crime, oh, there's a crime, oh, there's a crime, oh, there's a crime. And now you hear these things. And these are things like, you can just imagine that if I pulled one of these and gave this to you, at the start of your experience, like how does that transform your understanding of what the crime scene is? Like what did that do to like your ability to imagine what that crime scene is? Because what we find is that probably what happened is you had a vision in your head of what the crime scene was, and when this comes up, suddenly that has to shift. Because there's suddenly something that doesn't make sense to your story. And you have to revise your story to make it make sense.
And I think this aligns really in an interesting way when we developed and spent a lot of time with a paper prototype before we did anything with technology. And that paper prototype had like 4 key steps to it. We would go to people and we'd say, okay, here's a roll of masking tape. Go off and create a crime scene as a team. And they would go off and they get all super clever because they thought somebody else would have to solve it, right? And they'd be decapitating the head, maybe putting it on a silver platter, or they'd be separating the body parts out, or it'd be multiple bodies, whatever they wanted to do. And then they would come back and we'd say, okay, now on your person, find 3 things that you think are interesting to tell a story with. And we'd lay out brown paper and have them trace those objects, and they do that as an individual. And then we'd tell them to step back and pick 3 things that weren't their own, and to do that as an individual. And then they would go and place them around the bodies, but the only rule was that they couldn't place it around their original team's body. So then they go and they take an outline of a phone and they place it down near somebody's hand, or they take glasses and put it a few centimeters away from the body or whatever it was. And then they come back and we give them Post-it notes and we'd say, okay, as an individual, you can now go around to all the crime scenes except your own team's body, and you can lay down as many of these Post-its as you want. And these Post-its are going to be clues. So if you see that outline of an iPhone or whatever it is, you can say, last voicemail message from crying ex-girlfriend. You can put that down. As many people can put down as many as they want on that phone, or as many other objects as they want. And they do that as an individual, and then they come back, and then we say to them, okay, so now there are these bodies, there are these objects, and there are these clues. You don't have to use everything. Deductive reasoning, go. Now you're back as your original team, and you're going to go back to the body that you started with, and you're going to realize there are objects there, and there's clues there that you have never seen. And so as a team, you need to decipher it and come up with a story of what happened. Tell us what happened in the form of a story. And then each of the teams would present those things. So if you're going through and all of a sudden, the prompts that you guys just had are like creative disruptions, right? Everybody starts to think that they have a certain way that they're shaping this experience in their mind. And that it's kind of like what makes improv so powerful. Somebody takes it someplace you didn't expect, and then you have to be yes, and you can't just stop it, right? And then all of a sudden you're kind of down a path that introduces all these unexpected twists and turns, which makes it very entertaining for the people who are participating.
So we want to show you what happens with this as you start to collaborate more. So we're going to move on to a second prompt in the experience. This time we're going to actually work in teams of 2. So you're going to just pick somebody else in the audience. You're actually quite well paired up, actually. Already, most of you are already sitting next to one other person. So feel free to use that person. But if not, say hello to somebody. I'm sure we're all friendly here. What we'd like you to do is come up with a second prompt for later in the experience. So Lance described the kind of loop, right, where you leave. This isn't the same loop that exists in our current experience, but it's a similar-ish kind of loop, where you leave the crime scene you've created, you wander around some of the crime scenes, and you come back. And the moment you come back is a prompt from Scotland Yard that basically says, hey, good, you're back, you need to solve your crime. By the way, if you have any questions, we've been running some lab analyses here, tell us what you want. And at this point, the AI really kicks in. The AI starts looking for certain kinds of words. And if it gets those words, it will give you some kind of response. So there's sort of 2 things that happen with this prompt. One is that the AI listens for a word from you, and then when it gets that word, the AI triggers a response that's a new prompt. So I guess there's a kind of an infinite variety of words we could use here, right? Like could be keywords that could trigger something interesting, and we want to build an interesting experience. So I want you to just sort of imagine a word that you associate with a crime scene that you think could be a good launching point for a clue. Like, if you were going to talk about a crime scene, what's a word you might use naturally that you think might be an interesting thing to have someone talk to you about? People understand what I'm asking? So like imagine that I was just going to talk about a crime scene and you were going to respond to something, right? Like you were going to suddenly remember something. What's like a word I would use with a crime scene that you feel pretty sure that anybody who was talking about a crime scene might use?
Bloody,
Bloody? What else?
gruesome,
Okay, gruesome,
brutal, shocking,
shocking,
disturbing,
disturbing,
disruptive,
chaotic. Any like nouns or verbs? It's a lot of adjectives.
Splatter.
Okay, splatter, body,
Wearing.
wearing,
Forced entry, would that be one?
yeah, it could be entry or forced entry, witness,
Missing.
missing,
Position.
position. Cool. Okay, so for the second prompt, I'll just read some of these back to you so you have them. So keep some in mind, like one that you like keep in mind like one that you think is interesting. So I have here bloody, position, disturbing, splatter, body, wearing, missing, witness, shocking, gruesome, forced entry, disturbing. Like just pull one of those things out that interests you. Now, I would like you to come up with a prompt based on that word. So you hear a user say, let's take one for example, chaotic. And then Scotland Yard says, oh, chaotic, I've been meaning to tell you. Fact about your crime scene. Right? So if it's position, maybe it's something about the position of the body or something about the position of an object in the space. If it's missing, then it would be something that was missing from the scene. If it's wearing, it's obviously something that's related to what the victim could be wearing. Does that make sense? Pick any word you like and come up with any prompt that you think might make an interesting story.
But you need to do it in pairs.
Yeah, talk to the person next to you.
Can we see a show of hands if you've completed the prompt? Okay. Okay, excellent.
All right, so you want to shout out some prompts, like what your keyword was and what the prompt is?
Witness saw a man fleeing the scene wearing a black cape and a top hat.
Witness saw a man fleeing the scene wearing a black cape and a top hat. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Anyone else? Yes.
So our prompt was an excerpt from a witness statement.
Okay.
From where I was standing, it looked like he might have fallen off the cliff, but the body was positioned in an upright seated pose.
Okay. So this comes from a witness report, which is interesting. And a body, I'm not going to know it exactly, but a body falls over a cliff, and the position of the body is seated upright, which is total counter to what it would actually be. So somebody's obviously repositioned the body. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, anybody else? Yes, in the back.
Our victim is a woman, and she is missing some rings. And each of the rings that are on the hand, still on the hand, are known stones from different parts of Europe. So the person who's looking at it realizes that France is missing, and that's what's missing.
So each stone has a different. It comes from a different place in Europe, and they realize that France is the one that's missing. Okay, thank you very much. So missing was yours too. Missing. Okay, so that's interesting. So we had two that chose missing, and then there was the one with the position. Does anybody else have something? Yeah.
Yeah, we chose missing for some short, so it's like Scotland Yard is totally chaotic. So some of what you hear later on might be false information.
Okay. So some of what you hear could be false information. right? So that's the prompt that you say. They're so hectic at Scotland Yard, just be prepared that we might be incompetent and what we might tell you might not be true, basically. So now you have to doubt everything that you're hearing from the AI. Okay, okay. A little red herring there. Anybody else? Any others? Yes? No? I see. Okay.
Okay, so I want you to just notice like how the creative exercise was different when you did it with another person, right? That's like part of the point of this whole thing is that how did your creativity act differently? Did you come up with something that was different than what you came up with previously? Like that's like a lot of what this is about, and it's about creating these sort of natural ways of getting people to do this. This is a fairly artificial setting where we're just like team up with two people. But in the whole point of the Sherlock piece is to make that a natural process of just sort of stumbling into a bunch of people and then stumbling into the residue of other people's work. Now, one of the things that we see that's really interesting about this is the way that people's creativity from a similar seed is different. And of course, for the purpose of this experience, we would like to have multiple answers for individual prompts so that different groups could get different answers. That creates a lot more variety. So the next thing we'd like to do is do the same exercise, but I'll just give you the prompt that we're going to use. Like a prompt that I think is really interesting, that I think we should use in the piece. Because like my theory, based on the stuff that you came up with, and Lance and I were just talking about this, is that if you're doing this experience as a player, you're likely to start thinking of yourself as a detective, and you start role-playing as a detective, which means you'll start using detective language. Like you'll probably start talking to Scotland Yard like you were a detective, and you'll sort of riff on what you know from detective shows, and like you'll sort of think about what cops say in those contexts, like what you think cops say. It's like, oh, well, the time, it seems like the time of death of the victim was so-and-so, and the victim's body was positioned in this position, and we found this evidence here. And like you start using these words you don't use in normal language because you think of yourself as a cop. So the word that I found that nobody talked about yet that I think is really interesting is position.
Well, actually, one group used
No,
position.
it was missing, right?
No, it was position. One
Oh,
group
I thought it was
used
position. Oh, okay. So let's find another one. I like, let's see, witness got used. I didn't hear anybody use wearing specifically. I heard missing. Well, you said missing up there, right?
You said missing.
Yeah.
Define wearing because I actually thought that was apparel.
I don't know. Wearing. That's your prompt. Let's see what you come up with.
Okay. Yeah, so everybody, just for clarification, this next prompt will be the word wearing.
Yeah, the
Okay.
user, the prompt is that the user says the word wearing. And then Scotland Yard is like, oh, wearing, that reminds me. Blah. What kind of groups do you want to do for this one?
Well, let's mix it up. Why don't we do it in 4 people? This time you have to be paired up with another group of 2. Okay? Okay, does everybody have one? Do you guys have it? Let's hear what you guys have. Who wants to go first? Which group would like to share their prompt? Oh, yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Our group came up with the pants that the victim is wearing are jeans, but there's only one knee that's worn out.
Okay, so the pants that the victim is wearing are jeans, and there's only one knee that's worn out. Interesting. Okay. Anyone else here? Anybody else? How about another team? Yes, in the back?
Oh, are we? Yeah. She's wearing a very fancy Indian dress, and she also has henna. So we
Okay.
kind of speculate that she's part of she's a bride to an Indian wedding.
Okay. So she was wearing an Indian dress, and she had henna on. So you're on the hands. Okay. Okay, gotcha. So that she could be an Indian bride. Okay. Anybody else? The last team? Yeah.
Yeah, so we took a slightly different interpretation of wearing. So a kitchen timer was wearing down at the scene, and when Scotland Yard arrived, it read 59 seconds remaining.
Very nice. Okay, a different interpretation of that term. I think what's interesting, and it kind of comes off that very variance that you had, like even within the groups. And maybe you saw a difference from going as an individual to being paired up with two people than being in a group of like 4 or 5, how the creativity or the collaboration kind of changes. And some of the things that we're exploring with Sherlock Holmes and the Internet of Things is this idea of what is the grammar for, you know, collaborative storytelling? What is the grammar for, you know, here at Convergence, it's all about kind of different forms of storytelling, right? You can walk into the other room, they have VR that's going, there's different immersive experiences that are running, and everybody's trying to understand how can you tell a story when it doesn't necessarily have the same running times or the same conventions of, you know, screen or print. And so with this project, we're as much interested in the experience and the outcomes that the groups do as we are in terms of the collaborative practice of what it takes to help ignite the imagination of those participants. So even just a simple exercise that you guys ran through, the beauty of Sherlock Holmes and the Internet of Things is it's emergent. So there were things that came off of the prototyping that you just did with us that will definitely be in the experience. So if you come back towards the end of the month, you'll hear those things in the experience, which I think is exciting, because just listening to the way that you were using some of those simple prompts or those words was really fascinating, you know, and we were kind of riffing back and forth. It was like, oh, that's interesting, we should try that, or that's really cool. So I think in some ways we're trying to share as much of this project as we can. If you're interested, you can find out more at sherlockholmes.io. That's sherlockholmes.io. We document all the stuff that we do with it in an attempt to help define collaborative practice for new emergent forms of storytelling. I don't know if you want to close with anything.
No, that's it. I mean, I think it was, you know, I hope that this, you know, this is, we get lots of content from lots of people in these kind of environments, and we just hope that it can serve to just be an example for you of like the methodologies that we use to create these things, because like the idea of like asking people to respond to prompts and having them work in creative, strange groups is like inherent to the whole process. So we wanted to do more than just talk to you about it. We wanted to model it for you, and I hope that, like, by seeing that model, you can start to get a sense of like what, like, kinds of design go into designing collaborative creation. It's like thinking about questions of prompts, thinking about questions of group size, thinking about how people meet. Like, all of those are part of our process. And like Len said, it's an open project, so feel free to check out the materials, come to a meetup, and certainly play the experience when it runs here at Lincoln Center later this month.
Yeah, and in 2017, we'll also be doing stuff with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, too. So that's like the next adaptation that we'll be working on as well. So, yeah, I don't, we're out of time, right? So I want to thank you guys for participating today, and hopefully maybe we'll see some of you at the end of the month. We'll be announcing that through the Film Society to let you know when we're going to be running it. And we're working to maybe possibly be able to run it at night, which would be awesome. So thank you very much, guys.